Hello and welcome to this session on Challenging Sexism for God's Sake, a Psychological Perspective. In the fascinating story told in the first chapters of Genesis, we find a short description of the effects of sin in a fallen world. Of the handful of sentences that are used to describe these consequences, one of them has to do with the disrupted power relations between the sexes. In just a few short words that have had varied and devastating consequences throughout human history, God tells Eve that your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And so began a form of distorted patriarchy that has endured through the ages, disrupting human relations and impeding our efforts to collaborate as men and women in accomplishing God's mission in the world. In this basic description, we find men and women both complicit in this twisted pattern. Women desire the men in their lives, turning to them to fill roles that only God should fill, while men rule, taking advantage of the women in their lives. And as a consequence, gender-based inequality is the norm. Historically and across cultures, men have more resources, power, and status than women. The World Economic Forum tracks gender differences in things such as political empowerment and participation, economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, and health and survival. According to their most recent Global Gender Gap Report for 2021, the average distance completed to gender parity worldwide at this point in time is only at 68%. In fact, because of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women, the 2021 gap is actually larger than the gap the year before. The estimated time to close the gap, given current rates of progress, has increased in 1 year from 99.5 years to 135.5 years. So my task today as a psychologist is to provide an overview of how this imbalance of power plays out, helping to lay the scope of the unique challenges, barriers, and forms of oppression that women face. In the field of psychology, power imbalances between the sexes in all its forms is studied under the name sexism. I realize this is a challenging word that for some may carry connotations that blame men or that suggest intentionality in harming others. However, as I hope we'll see, both men and women treat women unfairly, and much of the unfair treatment happens outside of conscious awareness. And in fact, it often happens with good intentions. So today I will discuss ambivalent sexism, the most prominent contemporary theory of sexism, as well as structural sexism. I'll also address how sexism plays out in Christian contexts, and then outline 5 lessons learned from the research on sexism. Finally, I'll turn to what we can learn from psychology about how to combat sexism. Now, when unpacking the concept of sexism, it's helpful to distinguish between sexist attitudes, sexist beliefs, and sexist behaviors. Sexist attitudes can be both hostile or benevolent, which we'll discuss in more depth in the next few minutes. Sexist beliefs include things such as gender schemas that are sometimes known as gender stereotypes, as well as gender ideologies. Sexist behaviors include all kinds of violence against women, as well as discrimination, and the subtype of discrimination known as gender harassment. Ambivalent sexism is a theory that was proposed by psychologists Peter Glick and Susan Fiske to explain the ways in which sexism differs from other forms of prejudice, such as racism. Generally, prejudice takes the form of antipathy toward the target, as in the case of racism. But in sexism, the power differentials are enacted in the context of relationships in which men and women need each other for companionship, for sexual gratification, and for procreation. Consequently, in sexism, we find that it takes not only a hostile form, but also is complemented by a benevolent form of sexism. Benevolent sexism is experienced as subjectively benevolent by the perpetrator, and it might even be perceived as benevolent by the target. But it serves as a crucial complement to hostile sexism. It helps make societal inequality more palatable to women, recruiting them as unwitting participants in their own subordination. And so together, hostile and benevolent sexism create a system, a coordinated system of control that limits women's power, and not just in the interpersonal domain, but also in the larger economic and social and cultural domains. And so we might think about it as benevolent sexism is the carrot for conforming to patriarchal norms, and hostile sexism is the stick when women refuse to toe the line. Let me again be very clear that maintaining inequality does not require the conscious desire on the part of men or women to subordinate women. The general acceptance of ambivalent sexist ideologies and their role in shaping customs and institutions perpetuates inequality outside of conscious awareness. Now, in the context of ambivalent sexism, hostile sexism refers to an adversarial view of gender relations in which women are perceived as seeking to control men, whether this is through sexuality, through feminist ideology, or other means. In contrast, benevolent sexism idealizes women as pure creatures who need to be protected, supported, and adored, and whose love is necessary to make a man complete. While on the surface, this characterization may sound harmless or even laudable, in reality, it implies that women are weak and incompetent. It stereotypes women as having communal traits, things like being nurturing and helpful and warm, that uniquely equip them for domestic and low-status roles. Consequently, even though benevolent sexist attitudes and beliefs sound positive, they reinforce women's lower status. Now, I'm going to be saying quite a bit more about benevolent sexism, as it's probably less familiar than hostile sexism, and because, as we'll see a little later on, it plays a really crucial role in religious contexts. So benevolent sexism includes three different kinds of beliefs. The first of these is protective paternalism. Protective paternalism beliefs justify limiting women's access to resources and masculine roles by presenting women as being in need of protection. Women are seen as less than fully competent to make their own decisions and manage their own lives. So, some examples. Protective paternalism may take the form of a man stepping in to verbally defend a woman, even if she can defend herself, or taking on additional responsibilities in order to spare her without consulting her, or making a decision for her because it seems clear what is best for her, or telling her what to do rather than letting her find her own solutions. The second kind of benevolently sexist beliefs involve complementary gender differentiation. Men and women are presented as being different from each other in stereotypical ways. This demarcation of the gender boundaries is necessary in order to preserve the status distinctions, and it's done by attributing to men characteristics that are necessary for high status positions and by attributing to women characteristics necessary for low status positions. The resulting complementarity, which is often presented as a series of contrasts between men and women, is presented as being both natural and inevitable. So what does this look like in practice? Resulting behaviors might take the form of talking to male colleagues about work projects and hobbies, but to female colleagues about their homes and children. Or assuming that even in work settings, women will do the caregiving tasks, such as getting the coffee or taking the notes, or only being able to think of men when asked to identify a candidate for a leadership role. Finally, the third kind of benevolently sexist belief, heterosexual intimacy, idealizes a certain kind of Prince Charming and the Princess view of romantic relationships. And what this does is it preserves men's need for women's companionship and sexuality while also shaping the form that this intimacy will take. So again, what does this look like in practice? It can take the form of inappropriately introducing gendered romantic or appearance-based comments into conversation outside of the context of romantic relationships. Things like complimenting a woman who is not a romantic partner on her appearance, calling her sweetheart or darling or honey, or focusing on the wardrobe or hairstyles of prominent women public figures rather than on their job-related capacities. Or it might take the form in intimate relationships of expecting a romantic partner to meet all of one's needs. Benevolent sexism is particularly insidious because it's often seen as harmless, romantic, or even desirable, for example, in the form of chivalry. But abundant research has begun to track the ways in which benevolent sexism perpetuates inequality and harms women. In fact, the research suggests that it may be more detrimental than hostile sexism. Let me just give you a heads up that I'm going to be laying out a lot of research now at this point, because I think it's important to make the point of how dangerous benevolent sexism is. To date, studies have demonstrated that women higher in benevolent sexism blame the victims more in cases of acquaintance rape and when victims violate gender stereotypes, and that they generally endorse rape myths more. Benevolent sexism makes women more vulnerable to sexual violence, more prone to consume alcohol in excess, and more willing to take unwarranted financial risks. Exposure to benevolent sexism leads women to behave in ways that conform to gender stereotypes, even when they don't personally endorse benevolent sexism. The need to present oneself as sexually attractive to men is part of the gender stereotype, and exposure to benevolent sexism increases women's self-objectification and self-surveillance, preoccupation with appearance, and body shame. Suitability for primarily domestic roles is another part of the gender stereotypes, and so exposure to benevolent sexism leads women to ascribe less importance to competence and academic achievement, and to aspire less to leadership. Stereotypes present women as being less competent and in need of protection, and exposure to benevolent ideology increases women's intrusive thoughts of their incompetence, and it increases their recall of situations in which they have felt incompetent. In couples, more benevolently sexist men tend to produce more dependency-oriented support, things such as providing plans and solutions, and neglecting women's own abilities. And the research shows that this kind of behavior also increases women's feelings of incompetence. Research has demonstrated that not only do women think they are less competent when exposed to benevolent sexism, but benevolent sexism actually seems to make women less competent. It has been found to decrease women's cognitive performance by increasing self-doubt and by decreasing perceptions that one's actions will result in desired outcomes. In other words, it decreases a sense of self-efficacy. One really fascinating study also found that after being exposed to benevolent sexism, women showed a cardiovascular response that is characteristic of when people feel that they are being threatened in some way. And I want to make the point that in these studies, the exposure to benevolent sexism was not done by kind of hugely over-the-top types of sexist comments, but instead could be induced by things as mild as indicating in the experimental group that women are more cultured and sophisticated than men, or by having a Confederate come in and ask the woman, when the woman had been asked to pick up a box, say, "Here, let me get that for you." So we're talking about very mild forms of benevolent sexism that are able to produce these negative outcomes. So I want you to consider the cumulative effect of wandering through society, being exposed to these, on the surface, helpful and benevolent comments, and what that does to women's ability to perform the tasks that they have going on that day in the light of the threats to their competence and to their emotional well-being. Benevolent sexism also perpetuates inequality by reducing women's willingness to challenge gender discrimination, and it increases women's acceptance of inequitable social systems. Again, benevolently sexist ideologies are often presented as romantic, chivalrous ideals, and yet research shows that women who endorse benevolent sexism are also less likely to be satisfied with their marriages and more likely to seek divorce. And they tend to be more psychologically entitled in their relationships. When their partner misbehaves, when he does something that they don't like, they are more vulnerable to relationship distress. And this is especially true the longer the relationship lasts. Now, to this point, we have been addressing ambivalent sexism as it happens at the interpersonal level, but it's also important to recognize that sexism is perpetuated not only at the individual level, but also at the structural level. So sexist attitudes and beliefs and behaviors combine to create patriarchal systems in which there are systematic gender inequalities in power and resources that are reified, solidified through institutional practices, regulations, and even laws. For example, the United States has no guaranteed paid leave for mothers of infants. In fact, it's the only wealthy country in the world in this situation. And the lack of adequate paid leave makes work-family balance difficult, contributing to unemployment inequities. Structural sexism also includes symbols and practices that are used to reinforce gender stereotypes. So, for example, professional football reinforces stereotypes of both men and women by contrasting hyper-masculine aggression with sexualized displays by underdressed women that reinforce the idea that women are sex objects. Evidence for the relationship between ambivalent sexism and structural sexism can be found in a large multicultural study which showed that both hostile sexism and benevolent forms of sexism are correlated with national measures of economic and political gender inequity. Across nations, men's hostile and benevolent sexism scores correlated with United Nations indices of gender empowerment, things like women in high-status jobs and in government. It correlated with indices of gender development, things like women's education, longevity, and standard of living relative to men in the same country. In contrast, women's scores were only marginally or not at all correlated with these measures, supporting the idea that those in positions of power determine the distribution of resources. Let's move on now to how sexism is enacted in religious contexts, especially in Christian contexts. So let me begin broadly with the research on religion and sexism. Now, religions can contribute to sexism in a number of ways, through shaping attitudes and beliefs and roles, such as the ones that we have talked about already, through structural inequities, such as the structural sexism that we have been talking about, and through influencing the ways in which sexism is experienced by women. One large-scale study with participants from 97 countries found that even after controlling for education and income, religiosity was strongly correlated with gender inequitable attitudes. At the country level, overall religiosity was negatively related to various indicators of gender equality and well-being through the mechanism of gender norms and stereotypes. This study did not find any differences between world religions on these results, which I think is a very sobering finding for those of us who believe that following Jesus is associated with abundant life. If we focus more specifically on Christianity, research indicates that Christians are more conservative in their views about gender roles than the general population, but of course also show considerable variability in beliefs about women's roles, including leadership roles. The most conservative segments of Christianity is where we find more of an emphasis on the proper role for women in the home and the control of women's sexuality through purity culture ideologies. Fundamentalism, which is the tendency to hold beliefs in a cognitively rigid way, has been associated with sexism. Other religious variables associated with sexism are the valuing of tradition and conformity and the use of religion instrumentally to obtain other ends, such as social connection or comfort. In contrast, intrinsic religiosity, that is, the engagement in religion for its own sake rather than for the benefits that it produces, is negatively correlated with sexism. The concept of benevolent sexism is particularly helpful in understanding sexism as it occurs in Christian contexts, as several studies have shown that benevolent sexism rather than hostile sexism is more commonly used to justify patriarchal religious views. So what religions seem to do is it helps sexism to be accepted and imbued with moral and even spiritual significance. Concepts such as biblical womanhood and manhood throw God's weight behind certain stereotypes, and purity culture ideologies also overemphasized women's appearance by presenting bodies as shameful and as a source of temptation. One very sobering study found that even priming participants with Judeo-Christian concepts such as faith, baptize, God, divine, and sacred led to an increase in self-reported benevolent sexism above and beyond the contributions of gender and religious commitment. And in fact, this priming effect occurred even among participants who indicated that they did not believe in God. Now, I noted earlier that religions influence gender ideologies, structural inequities, and the experiences of women. So far, we've been talking primarily about gender ideologies. So how do gender inequities come into the picture? Here, let me rely on a large-scale study by sociologists Patricia Homan and Amy Burdett, who explored religious structural sexism in some large nationally representative data sets. They examined structural sexism in church contexts by measuring things such as whether women were allowed to serve on the governing board, whether they were allowed to be the head clergy person, whether they were allowed to teach in co-ed classes, or whether they were allowed to preach at main worship services. And so these served as indicators of the power and resources available to women in these church contexts. And what they found is that increased structural sexism was correlated with decreased self-reported health. In fact, women in the more structurally sexist churches had similar self-reported health as women who do not attend church. Although attending church is well known to be beneficial to one's health, this benefit appears to only be true for women in less structurally sexist churches. We've now discussed religion's influence on gender ideologies and on structural inequities. And so let me move on now to how religions influence the experiences of women who are subjected to sexism. And here I draw on my own research. In a study that my colleagues and I conducted, we asked women whether they had witnessed or been subjected to a number of different forms of both hostile and benevolent sexism. We also asked if the act had been motivated by the person's, the aggressor's Christian beliefs and commitments. What we found is that perceiving that sexism was motivated by Christian beliefs potentiated, it increased, it made more harmful the effects of sexism on the women's evaluations of their institutional climate in this context. In other words, sexism as it occurs in Christian contexts can be particularly helpful to women because God is invoked in justifying the sexism, and perhaps because the beliefs are then consequently seen as being more immutable, less changeable. This review of the psychology of sexism and its interface with Christianity has covered a lot of ground, so let me pause at this point to highlight some of the most salient points that I hope are takeaways from this talk. First, I want to note that sexism is both a target of mission as an important and pervasive way in which sin has influenced the world, and a barrier to mission, not just because it limits the opportunities women have to serve, but because it decreases women's emotional and cognitive resources for engaging in mission. Second, sexism is not something that men do to women, but it's something that men and women do to women, often, again, outside of conscious awareness. So the target of sexism are patterns of relating and the structures resulting from those patterns in which men and women are both complicit. In the large multinational study I mentioned earlier, men's and women's sexism scores correlated very highly with each other. While women's hostile sexism tended to be a little lower than men's, their benevolent sexism was sometimes actually higher than the men's in their particular country. A third and related point is that sexism doesn't just hurt women. Sexism against women also hurts men. While it might be assumed that holding to sexist gender ideologies would benefit men because of the power that it gives them, these gender ideologies come at a price. Systematic literature reviews show that men who endorse traditional masculinity ideologies, which again are part of that benevolent sexist package, tend to experience increases in a variety of negative interpersonal and personal problems, including things such as dangerous risk-taking, alcohol and substance abuse, hostility and aggression, self-esteem issues, depression, anxiety, marital and family problems, and problems with relation satisfaction and intimacy. Many of these problems can be traced to the fact that these masculinity ideologies serve as a kind of emotional and behavioral straitjacket for men. A fourth point is that not all women are subjected to sexism in the same way. Other aspects of our identity deeply influence the ways in which we are discriminated against, a point that's made by intersectionality theory. So different aspects of our identity, such as gender, race, class, sexual orientation, parental status, etc., come together to influence our experiences, and these are not simply additive. For example, Black women do not experience discrimination merely as the sum of racism and sexism, but instead they experience discrimination as Black women, in which their gender and racial characteristics intersect to produce unique ways of being discriminated against. So research shows that Black women may be subjected to intersectional stereotypes that objectify and sexualize or exoticize them, such as expectations of being a Jezebel or an angry Black woman. In another example of intersectionality, parental status interacts with sex, in that research demonstrates that discrimination faced by women in the workplace seems to primarily, though not exclusively, be directed at mothers. A fifth point is that, in general, Christianity seems to have made things worse rather than better. The statement, of course, needs to be nuanced. Problematic versions of Christianity are those that are more fundamentalist, that advocate for traditional gender ideologies, that justify sexism by appealing to religion, that are engaged in for personal benefit, and that are enacted in sexist structures. So we must address sexism in all its contexts, but we must not neglect the rather large log in our own eye. Sexism is clearly a serious and pervasive problem. How should it be addressed? Many good resources are available for addressing specific types of sexism, such as physical abuse, or sexism in specific contexts, such as the workplace. So here I intend to focus more on some big picture issues. Let me suggest 3 strategies to keep in mind in moving forward. First, we need to disentangle sexism from the good news about Jesus Christ. Much of the conflict around gender in Christian circles has centered around women in leadership in church contexts. Now, having women in leadership is an important research, as evidenced by that research on structural sexism that I reviewed earlier, but it's not the only issue. We need to pay more attention to ways in which sexist ideologies have become entangled with the message of Christianity at all levels, including the messages we give about appearance and sexuality through purity culture beliefs, the messages about how marriages should function that impede intimacy and put women at risk for violence, and even the typical ways that women and men relate in both work and church-related contexts that leave women segregated and outside of informational networks and decision-making contexts. Sexism is a broader issue than who should be the pastor. Second, we need to confront sexism when we encounter it. Cornel West wrote, "None of us alone can save the nation or world, but each of us can make a positive difference if we commit ourselves to do so." This may sound very simple, but research indicates that most people remain silent in the face of sexism. This may be because confrontation requires a number of different things to happen. It requires people to detect discrimination, decide that it's worth confronting, take the responsibility to confront, and then decide how to confront. Confrontation can also be very uncomfortable, but it is effective. When confronting sexism in Christian circles, we should lean into the motivational resources that are available to us, foremost of which are the concepts of love of neighbor, compassion, and putting the needs of others before our own. My experience in this area is that many people who engage in sexist practices do so from the best of intentions. So the best way to confront benevolent sexism in particular is to highlight its negative consequences, which is why I've spent so much time doing so today. When people are shown that their well-intentioned actions are actually hurting others, their sexist actions tend to diminish. Even outside of Christian contexts, research shows that confronting sexism when it occurs can reduce sexism by increasing perpetrators' awareness and by reducing the likelihood that they will continue to act in sexist ways. Research also shows that assertive, non-aggressive confrontation, while challenging, as it involves controlling our anger at the offense, will have better outcomes than aggressive confrontation. Third, men and women should cooperate to confront sexism. Sexism is not just a women's problem. Having men as allies can be very beneficial, as research shows that when men confront sexism, offenders experience more self-directed negative emotions, they view the confronter more positively, and they perceive the confrontation as being more legitimate. Men also have more structural power, so they're often better positioned to address sexism. Whenever possible, men should support women in confronting rather than taking over, in order to, again, avoid benevolently sexist paternalism in the act of confronting sexism. Many of my comments today have highlighted how Christianity has been complicit in denying women access to power, so let me end on a more positive note by reminding you that many of the early pioneers in advocating for women's rights were motivated by their Christian faith. When we care about these issues, we are following in the well-trodden tradition of advocating for the dignity and well-being of all humans, because all humans are made in God's image. These pioneers include people like Christine de Pizan, who wrote the Book of the Ladies, of the City of Ladies in 1405, to combat misogyny by arguing that God loves men and women equally. These pioneers include Quaker Margaret Fell Fox, who wrote a pamphlet in 1666 defending women's right to preach. These pioneers include the many Christian men and women who launched first-wave feminism by meeting in the basement of a church and drafting a declaration addressing the role of women in society during the famous Seneca Falls Conference of 1848. Christians began the movement to address power inequalities for women. Let's continue in their path by challenging sexism for God's sake.